And the idea for a window of trainability is that when we're working with athletes or even founders to a certain extent, we're always assessing how open that window is to give them a massive amount of stress.
Give me attributes that make up the super founder.
Our goal is, to really showcase outlier founders.
You cannot invent and pioneer if you cannot accept failure.
We wanted people that were insanely great at what they did.
Nobody was making any money at all. Most people thought the internet was going to be a fad.
Awesome. All right. Today on the podcast, I've got Bryan Smith here from Leon VC. But Bryan, welcome to the podcast.
I'm super excited to be on, man. Hopefully, like I was saying to you before, I have active COVID right now. So if I sound a mess, I apologize to all the listeners.
Yeah, he's playing through the pain, and I forced him to be camera on for this. So the double whammy right there. You can't hide behind the black screen. But no, very, very cool of you. Well, cool, man. Well, first, just at a high level, like, what is Leon VC? Just so people know, like, the context of this.
Yeah. So, I'll give you an idea of my background first, and I'll sort of just give you the story as far as, where Leon VC came from. So, in a previous life, I'm not that old, but it feels like a previous life at this point. I was a director of sports science for USA Track and Field. And I worked with the European Premier League and NFL and whatnot, right? And, ultimately what we did is we used data science to predict performance and predict injury in athletes during in-season. And then off-season, we were using data to sort of profile athletes before a draft, right? Or if we're working in the European Premier League, it was about, using data to understand the athlete that we're potentially about to purchase, through another club or whatnot. What are the risks associated with buying that athlete, right? So, I did that for a bunch of years. And then we started Leon VC, using a data model that we took from professional sports, which was all about understanding and predicting founder success in startups, right? So primarily what we do is we work with roughly about 175, 200 funds to quantify something we call founder potential. Before investing within a startup or a founder in early stage, right? And then we also have a $20 million fund off of that where we co-invest in the founders that we work with or that we do diligence on. And then we also have a community off of that where we support early stage founders as well.
That's super impressive. And I actually want to get to the sports science for a second, because if you're working with a professional team for the Premier League and they're about to just hand over truckloads full of money to an athlete, similar to like an acquisition of a deal, you want to do due diligence. So can you give any examples of, like, okay, you're going to like invest in this midfielder, you're going to hand over millions of dollars. What are some of the attributes you're breaking down where it's like age, like history of health, like stats you're looking at? Are you getting into like their dad and their mom's like biological history? Like what, like drop some knowledge on us.
Yeah, it gets crazy, especially in Europe, right, where the laws are a little bit different. But if we're talking about European Premier League, the good thing about in the EPL is, they have junior teams and whatnot, right? So the amount of data that you can pull is massive. So if we're talking about minutes played, any sort of volume-based activity and intensity-based activity that we can collect on an athlete, right? So that could be something as looking at like GPS monitoring and understand like how many miles did he run over his period of a career at a certain level of intensity, right? Because we can use that to understand potential risk within hamstring injuries and whatnot, right? But we also look at like slow brainwave activity. So if we're getting into like real like due diligence, we'll look at heart rate variability. We'll look at slow brainwave activity using EEG. We'll look at blood analytics. We'll look at jump testing. We'll look at strength testing. In some countries, we even do muscle biopsies to look at like muscle fiber makeup.
Oh my gosh!
Potentially how to train this athlete and how to develop this athlete. In the States, like if we're working with like an NBA team, a lot of that same data is looking at, playing time, and statistics related to the sport, but also, how many games or minutes they played within, college or high school or whatnot, collecting subjective feedback from previous coaches, maybe mentors, whatever else. But then, like I said before, using a lot of that sort of physiological data to help us understand, really, it's about understanding the potential of the athlete, right? It's about understanding, I use this analogy about like a window of trainability, right? And the idea for a window of trainability is that when we're working with athletes or even founders to a certain extent, we're always assessing how open that window is to give them a massive amount of stress, right? And a lot of that's going to be dictated by past experience, previous trauma, all these different things, right? And essentially what it's looking at is how much stress has that athlete been how much stress has that athlete taken in throughout their career, right? And how closed is that window? Because if that window is wide open, the potential for that athlete to improve is massive. But if they've peaked early, or they had a coach that maybe pushed them too hard or whatnot, then we know that window is sort of closing a little bit. So the level of
Interesting.
stress that we can give that athlete is now limited.
Wow. So it's not like, well, they can endure a lot of stress. It's like they've taken a lot and that window is closing is what they can continue to sustain. Is that a dumbed down
Exactly. I mean,
version
look at
of
like
that?
LeBron, like coming out of high school, right? You saw his capacity to be able to perform at a high school level, but relatively speaking, his minutes were low, and the amount of games he's played and activity he's done compared to, a college player. So in his case, he's peaking at this obnoxious level, but he hasn't experienced much stress and much volume and much intensity throughout his career compared to a 4-year, collegiate, player. So, obviously, LeBron is the outlier, but then you look at someone like Steph Curry, where he's a complete outlier, right? And ultimately, with Leon, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to understand who the outlier founders are, who maybe didn't go to Stanford, or maybe didn't go to MIT or Harvard or whatever else, and they might not get a look within the VC space because they don't have those KPIs of the traditional sort of venture world. And with us and with our diagnostic, we took our diagnostic, we benchmarked it against MOIC with like 150 funds. So we were able to look for a correlation coefficient against our data and financial outcomes, or, predictive, financials with MOIC. So that's what we do, man. I mean, our goal is, to really showcase outlier founders and really, give the market an idea as far as who has the capacity and the potential to be a great founder, even though they didn't go to MIT or wherever else.
Yeah. Well, first off, that's super exciting. Well, even going back to sports for 1 second, and we'll put a pin in it. Like when you look at the draft, like I'm a huge NBA fan. There's these iconic drafts where it's like obviously Michael Jordan went number 3 and Sam Bowie went number 2, and I mean that changes not even a franchise but a city if he goes to Portland instead of Chicago, and even like 2017, like Markel Fultz went number 1 and he's kind of been a bust, whereas Jason Tatum's number 3. And like the amount of data and like analysis I bet that goes into that is just insane. It's, I mean, these are like decade altering decisions for these programs. So you're basically like, I've done this with sports. How do we flip it on the business side? And so actually, I'm going to just start with the haymaker question because this is the one we all want to know. Give me the like attributes that make up the super founder that the data shows. So people listening to this can be like, absolutely, that's me. Or it's like, oh crap, I don't have that. Like, can you give any like give us the cheat sheet? Like, what are the attributes of those super founders? Because you've got this data set that you're like pulling together. And any tidbits you can get.
I mean, it's difficult because the way our data model is built out, it's based off relative analysis, meaning looking at
Mm-hmm.
comparing founders versus founders rather than having a limit score, right? So we have something called, which is our founder potential score, and that has no upward bound limit, right? So on
Yeah.
average, founders score within probably around like 8 to 10, which is probably above 80th percentile. But we've had some founders who've scored 13, 14, 15, above that, right? Now, what
Mm-hmm.
makes up that score is we look at roughly about 29 different metrics. That
Mm-hmm.
ranges from personal well-being type metrics like what do you sleep, how resilient are
Mm-hmm.
you, what is your burnout risk, things along those lines. We also look at your subjective opinion of the current state of the company, right? So, what does your culture look like? What is your thought process in building culture? How do you build sustainable teams? Yada yada
Mm-hmm.
yada. But also, we look at some of the investor type metrics, right? And we also dig deep into like the team itself, and to really sort of figuring out on a team level, how does the team that you're potentially investing in, how do they perceive the company that we're looking
Yeah.
at? But to break it really down, when we're looking at a great founder is going to be someone who's highly, highly resilient. Now, it's
Yeah. How do
resilient.
you measure resilience?
Well, resiliency, and can I curse on this podcast, by the way?
Go for it.
All right,
Absolutely.
it's a fucking bullshit term, right? And this is what I'll say about this. Now we use it because it's a catch-all phrase, but there's a great research. Are you out in West Coast by any chance?
Yeah, I'm in Seattle.
Okay, so Stanford, there's this great researcher named Robert Sapolsky, and there's for your listeners, there's an amazing book called "Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers," right? And this book is all about stress and stress adaptation, and what he talks about in the book is that how adaptable and how resilient we are is not so much of like I meditate fucking every day. It's not about that, right? There's so many other factors that come into play, even including um, epigenetic factors. There was an amazing research study about epigenetic factors, and they looked at Holocaust survivors, and they looked at the great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And what they showed is that the great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors either had an overabundance of a certain hormone that allowed them to adapt to stress in a very, very high rate, or underabundance of that adaptable hormone that allowed them to adapt at a very, very high rate. So the ability for these people to be resilient was dictated not by how long they meditate or what they do, but also by the genetic factors that were influenced through their grandparents and whatnot, right? So when we talk about what makes up a great founder and we talk about resilience, we look at things like, where did you grow up at and what type of environment? Did you move countries? All these other things to really sort of understand what are some of these factors other than you sleep well and you meditate every single day that potentially make you a very, very resilient person? Does that make sense?
Cool. So obviously resilience is a big key trait that like there's 29 things that it's evaluating. Resilience is a big one. You hit on culture. What are some of those other factors you're scoring or grading?
Yeah. So we're looking at founder dependency. All right. We're looking at investor pressure. We're looking at general perception of the product itself and then sort of, what they're sort of building right now. Like I said, we're looking at culture. We're looking at team makeup. We're looking at, how you sleep. We're looking at how you exercise, all these other things to sort of just give us some understanding of the capacity of this founder to be able to grow and scale a successful company.
I feel like grow and scale a company, and also like maybe they're a great founder for a seed round or an A round, but are they the right founder for a C round or going public?
That what gets really different because when we start talking, this is, if you think from a sports standpoint, the physiological and psychological makeup of an NFL quarterback versus an offensive lineman are going to be completely different, right? Same way with the NBA with the point guard and Joel Embiid. Going to be very, very different, right? Now, in the startup space, the makeup of a SaaS founder and a biotech founder are completely different, right? And the profile of a early seed stage founder and a Series A, Series B, Series C founder is completely different. So when we work with funds, we're tracking this data longitudinally over time to sort of look for inflection points where, not necessarily saying you have to let go of a founder or replace him from a CEO standpoint, but it is it's understanding how does the fund coach up that founder, over time to get them to a point. So, and we're not there yet as far as the profiling. We can get into certain, not from a Series A and sort of, growth stage companies, and we're mostly in early stage, but we definitely have profiles of, SaaS founders, of, direct to consumer founders, of, biotech and healthcare founders. They're very, very different.
Yeah, no, that's fast. And how are you getting this data? Is it public available data? Are you getting some access to private data? Do you have these founders go to a founder combine and you put them on a treadmill? Like what's happening?
Yeah, so it's important to understand how the data model was built, right? So when we first started out, what we did is we pulled diligence data with over 100 funds of all their diligence data. So we looked at, reference checks, we looked at resumes, we looked at founder interviews, we looked at financial data and whatnot. And that built up sort of the composite data model to help us understand what makes up a successful founder, right? But in this case, we dumbed it down to roughly about a 3-minute diagnostic, so it's not 2 hours long or anything like that. But within 3 minutes, we can generate on average per diagnostic roughly about 70,000 data points on a founder. And then we start adding a bunch of other stuff. We can pull in reference checks into that, and that all gets pulled into the founder potential score, all sorts of different things.
That's crazy. So you get access through 100 funds to this data set. You're able to go through and see, like, okay, of these outperformers, what did they have that made them kind of above average? So talk to me about the application and use of this, right? So this is really powerful data where you get insights to make decisions that have millions of dollars behind it, right? Because you all gonna work a few different ways, like with your own fund, you're helping connect founders, you've got a community. Like, walk me through that. Like, are funds just like hitting you guys up, like, all right, you're our new due diligence arm, and you're helping us like do the final mile of these deals?
Yeah, I mean, well, what's interesting about, investing, and I posted something on LinkedIn about this recently, is that the amount of dollars that are spent on understanding, who you draft in the NFL draft from a diligence standpoint is massive, right? But if you look at it from a diligence standpoint with an early stage investment, and granted, they're not writing, $20 million checks to one founder who's going to like be the, the king of the empire for the next 7 to 10 years, right? Hopefully, but in this situation, the amount of diligence that's done in early stage founders is next to nothing, right? For the most part, it's like, it's a fucking walk in the park for 3 hours to tell you if I like this founder or not. It's completely subjective, right? Um, and so, and for us, as far as there's a couple different ways we work with funds. We either build out custom data models for funds where it's benchmarked against their own data set and it's continuously updated with more diagnostic data, reference checks, background checks, and whatnot, and that sort of just gives them their own sort of model to sort of benchmark that's proprietary to them. And then we just do, simple diligence for a bunch of other funds, right? Where if they're thinking about investing, we either work with an analyst or, some sort of scout or whatever to do diligence right from the start. Or to your point, it's done in the last mile where, they've done all the traditional due diligence. Now we want to assess the founding team. So that's when we're due diligence there. Now, the good thing from us from a fund standpoint is that, with any of the funds we work with, we have the ability to co-invest. So really, our thesis is all based around the data. If a founder fits our model, all right, and the fund that we work with does the traditional diligence and they're going to invest, that's enough of a signal for us, assuming our data model sort of matches up.
Right. Yeah, that's your unfair advantage. It's like they're bringing you the deal flow, and then it's like going off the charts on your model. You're like, wow, this would be an amazing investment thesis for us. Let us dive in. That's very cool. So for the listeners, to put a bow on it, to be the super founder, to have your algorithm, to be like to have your stuff go off the charts, what do I need to do? I need to be resilient. I need to build the most amazing culture. I probably need to have some awesome track record. Is there anything around like, being really good at just grit and like overcoming tough things? Can you see that like someone came from like a single mom, someone came from the projects, or wow, this person was like had life handed to them on a silver spoon?
And that's what I was sort of talking about before we cut off, is that this concept of resilience or adaptability, which I was mentioning in that book, is driven by so much more than how you feel about yourself, right? Or, if you meditate or work out every single day. And a lot of times, previous trauma, all right, regardless if it's from a broken household or, grew up in an unstable environment, whatever, that can either make us or break us, right? And some people take that trauma and they're able to sort of capitalize on that, assuming other things have been put in place. And other people, it's a complete opposite, right? But we do know we've looked at this actually. We've pulled in like work history, um, parental, background and where you grew up and whatnot. And for the founders who have been put in great positions who came out of that environment, as long as they got out of the projects or, if we're talking about that, they're most of the time extremely adaptable, extremely resilient. And, the data supports this, right? Founders who've lived in other countries that moved to the States, usually end up being more successful founders. Women founders usually end up being more successful founders. But the problem is that, or minority founders, we've talked to a ton of funds about minority founders. And from a financial metric standpoint, they're usually outliers from a positive standpoint about having great financial metrics at exit or at funding round or whatever else. Right. So, but the problem is that most of the founders look like you and I that live in a certain area that went to a certain school and they don't get looked at because they didn't work at Facebook or, wherever else. Right. Um, but, and I listen, I mean, VC in this world is about mitigating risk as much as possible. Right now, we support on that, but VC is also about finding outliers. And if you don't have data that can sort of help you find those outliers, then you're never really going to find those outliers. You're just going to be fucking lucky.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, and then this allows you to get smarter and smarter and learn from your wins or from your losses, right? How much of it is paired with right idea or industry selection? Because I read some stuff that's around like it's not about finding the right solution, but choosing the right problem to go after, or is it mainly just focus on the people portion of it? Because that's kind of your unfair advantage with what you've done in your previous life.
Yeah. Yeah. We really can't tell you about, the business model and whatnot. I mean, there's better VCs and there's better funds out there that, have, both the investments and the people to be able to sort of tell you that. Right. But we want to be able to tell you about the things you don't know, all right, which is going to be about the founder and the founding team.
No, that's amazing. I'm also interested in like the community aspect that you guys are doing, because for me that's super interesting. Because in addition to like serving funds with the data, you're investing COSA next to them. You also have like a founder studio, and you have this community. Elaborate more on that because that's fascinating. Because you guys are kind of like doing this kind of like full circle approach to like what you offer.
Yeah. So the founder community is for, the very, very early stage founder. And then what we do is we do our complete diligence package and process on the founders when they come into our community free of charge. Actually, I think it's $10 a month, right? So they can come in, we do the complete profile. We do reference checks. We do our founder potential diagnostic. We do an organizational health assessment. So if they have a team, we assess their team. And then we provide coaching opportunities and resources and discounts and everything else around that to be able to support their founders. One thing about me and, our team is I really just want to help people and I really just want to help founders, so that's why we bring them in the community, give them everything they need to understand as far as how do you be a better founder. All right. And then we'll also, introduce you to our VC funds and some of our partners and whatnot at the right point in time, because we find that so many founders try to go to market and try to raise, you know, and they just don't understand what they need, all right, or what they need to actually be working on to be a great founder first and foremost, right? Because if you're not a great founder, none of this shit is going to work. Unless you're extremely lucky, all right, and you nailed market timing, to a certain extent, but you have to be a great founder, and that's what we want to do. Is we want to build better founders, and then from there, hopefully your company succeeds, and that's it.
Yeah. And so by going into that, because I think it's kind of tough sometimes to like hear what you're not good at, but that's like what you need to grow if you have that growth mindset, right? So by going into that, could someone like me go in there? Could I do the assessment or the diagnostic and get my score and see maybe where I'm strong, but also where I'm lacking, so I know where to improve? Is that an opportunity, or is it more so community to like work with others to like learn and like lift each other
Yeah,
up?
I mean, all that stuff's there. Obviously, and we'll do events and all those other things. But any new founder that comes into our model or into our community, everybody gets a founder potential diagnostic. So we'll do that. We'll generate. We have an LLM model that generates all the data that we need. We spin up a report for you, compare you to against other founders. And then from there, obviously, the community stuff is going to be about like how can we expand on some of the data that we're seeing, right? So like for right now, we're doing like I think right now like 97% of all the founders, within our community are extremely stressed out. So what did we do? Right? We built out a framework library to be able to help founders to educate on things that they can improve. We've partnered with AIM7 to give them, like wearable data and start tracking their HRV and sleep and all these other things. We partner with BetterHelp so we can get them talk therapy. We have events around stress management, and we have HR folks coming on, and that's the goal. Is every month we look at what founders are struggling with, all right, and then we provide resources and education to be able to support founders during that time.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I will say though, I love the founder potential score. I'm picturing like the ESPN 100 or like 5-star athletes where like you're owning that rating. You're like the Michelin star, right? For founders and putting that out there. Because the other thing, I mean, yeah, I love giving people ideas to their business as if they haven't already thought about it because they think of it more than anybody else. But the other thing, like that you're probably very much aware of, is the like buy rather than build movement of acquisition entrepreneurship. Because so many people, I'm seeing their issue is like placing CEOs and placing founders, whereas you all have this database of like founder potential score, people that would be amazing in. Well, you could even make the distinction. Are they amazing in the founder role or amazing in the CEO role? Because there's times where it's the same and there's times where it's very different, right? But I feel like the wave you're riding of having this kind of like stable of really talented founders, CEOs, and operators is something that the applications could be big even outside of the startup
It's
ecosystem.
actually it's actually an idea I didn't think of. So thank you for that. That's a great idea.
Yeah, that one's definitely free. But because yeah, we work with one client. They're a COS. It's kind of like the entrepreneur operating system, but it's for CEOs, and they're working on like this CEO assessment score. It's not data. It's not as like backed as the one that you're doing, and it's for like not startup founders. It's very different, but I think it's something that I think the right CEOs really embrace because they want to know where they're weak and where they can get better, right? Because if not, if you have that blind spot, man, that could come back to haunt you down the road. I would assume.
Yeah, and the hard part about looking for correlations, within CEOs of large companies, there's so much noise in that data as far as what makes up a great CEO, right? And that was and we looked at it. We looked at going into private equity and some of the M&A space and whatnot. But the good thing about early stage is that founders have so much of an impact of what happens in a company at that stage, right? So you're not influenced by the stock price or whatever else. It's just this one specific thing, which is mostly going to be a founder and a founding team, and what can they do to help drive this company forward, right? So it's fairly easy to develop some sort of data model off of it.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm also always interested in people's own like unfair advantage or their unique lens that gives them a different perspective. You have one that's like very, very interesting coming from sports. What's one thing coming from sports and what you've done with sports and data that you now like set your sights on business and founders? What's something that's maybe that we would not expect that when you look at it from that lens, it's something different that we need to start shedding our eyes on.
Yeah, I guess I would look at is that in sports, the athlete is the asset, right? And the athlete is the individual that you need to protect at all costs. And the way that I, run my company or, whatever else, it's always going to be people first. And I know that sounds like some bullshit HR term, you know, but there's a great term, or there's a great like analogy I use is the teams that win are the teams that can repeat performance over and over and over again with minimal people cost, right? And I mean, so if I can reduce that cost as much as possible, or founders can reduce those people costs as much as possible, then you can always get more out of them in a sense where we're keeping that window open, right? So with my team, I'm always looking to keep that window open.
Yeah. No, I think that's so good. And there's this whole movement, like the executive team should have the CHRO person on there because people literally are like the things that get growth. Because it's like, yes, you want to have the right idea. Yes, you have the right market. But if you have the right team, they're going to find a way to the right market and the right idea, right? To get you on that path. And I think so many times, like people want to think of like the light bulb moment, but really it's like, do you have the rock star team that's going to help you weather the storm, and are you data driven on that, as opposed to just being like, oh, I vibed with that person or we clicked, you know what I mean? But we're really looking at it the right way. I mean, honestly, like I'm like just now building out my executive team. I'd love to be able to apply the model to the executive team, right? To really have that data driven approach. Obviously, like the founder is the biggest lever to pull, but for like growing companies, like are you guys applying this to executive teams as well?
Yeah, I mean, from a data standpoint, yeah. I mean, it depends on the size of the company. But yeah, the plan is to be able to move into private equity and whatnot, and start looking at, when a firm is about to acquire a company, what does the makeup of the executive team look like? And is it something worth purchasing, or do you have to make a change?
Oh, that's amazing, man. um so I'm interested. I've got a couple more questions. One is like, what's kind of the goal with Leon VC? Because what you guys are doing, it's one of those ideas. It's not like if it'll happen, but when it'll happen and how big. It's clearly happening because of the success that you had. But like, why? Like firms and funds wouldn't be adopting this. It's a hard case to go against it, right?
You know what? It's sort of like, and I use sports analogies probably entirely way too much. Um, but the VC world right now is sort of like the 1970s high school Texas football coach, right? That thinks that the only way you win is if players throw up after practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, two a days. Let's go.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? And you see that transition, or and hopefully we're trying to lead that transition, is that where there's just better ways to be able to assess investments, to be able to assess founders, to coach founders, right? And that's what we want to move towards. Like we want to go from the 70s high school football coach to, what you see in front offices right now in professional teams.
Yeah, kind of Moneyball style as far as doing it the right way. That's super interesting, man. What other industries are ripe for disruption with this, or what other applications? I mean, maybe those are the two big ones: is sports and then like founders and executives, because that's where people viewed as an asset have the biggest ROI potential, right? The other thing that could be cool but not as lucrative is in the teaching world, right? That would be amazing to see the teachers that could have the biggest impact on students and whatnot. But I don't even know how you start to gain that data set.
Well, I mean, there's so much there, because you want to take, regardless if it's teaching or managing people and whatnot, it's always about taking this sort of n equals one type approach, right? And there's another great book, and it's by that same author, Robert Sapolsky, that I mentioned a little bit ago, right? And it actually just came out. And the argument of his book is that there's no such thing as free will, right? And that within free will, or the decisions that we make, is all dictated by biochemical processes within the body that have sort of done whatever, right? And which is really interesting if you think about it. But in that situation, and I think about understanding this concept of there is no free will, and I'm not going to argue if there's a free will or not, right? That's for other smarter people to do. But the idea here is that if if there's so many other processes that are involved in how we make decisions and actions we take, are we going to be more empathetic to people in general when they make poor actions, right? And I think that when you start using data, it start opens up this model where you can treat that individual not necessarily like a data point, but you can take this n=1 approach where every individual is different, right? So if it's managing people, if it's coaching kids, if it's teaching kids, whatever, it's understanding that we're also inherently different, and the way that you manage me versus you or whatever else, or the expectations or how resilient they are, is going to be dictated by so many other things that are completely out of our control and that we're absolutely not aware of, right? So I think the value of data is that it at least gives you a lens to be able to view an individual or a student or whatever else, and to provide you sort of a path, right? And that ultimately, that's what data should do. It should provide you a direction. It's not going to tell you how to solve anything. It's not going to, whatever, but it's going to give you a path to say, this is the right thing to do to this individual based off what I'm seeing. And that's what they do in sports, and that's what we're trying to do, in startups.
Yes, I'm in 3 hours. I have to go coach a first grade basketball team, so I'm going to apply this methodology to those wild kindergartners.
Well, that's perfect, right? Because you see it all day, and like I love coaches because it's not like you're hiring a bunch of marketers, right? Growth marketers, right? Where they all look the same, whatever. But in basketball, it's like you have this little kid who's 5'2", but it's like feisty, or you're first grade, so he's like 3 foot, whatever, but super feisty as hell, and you could push that person, whatever, and you start developing mental models of like, how can I coach this kid? What is potentially their skill set based off I'm seeing? And a lot of being a great leader is about having these your heuristics or mental models that will allow us to place buckets to understand how to make the most impact for that individual.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting, and that really resonates. That's super fascinating. Okay, cool. I'm gonna hit you with some speed round stuff, and I'll ask you with one last question. And I was not kind enough to give Bryan a warning of any of these ahead of time, so he has to do these while he's sick. So that's fine. What's like a productivity win that you feel like you have that other people should apply?
ADD. How about that one?
Just makes you go really fast. Nice. Uh, what's like something you do to start your day or in the morning that helps you win the day?
I think coming from the world of, sports and whatnot, I would love to say like I jump in an ice bath or something along those lines, right? But I don't have one of those, man. It's like I have 3 kids, so I get up, I have my cup of coffee, do what I need to do, and just, I guess the one thing I do is, I have a whiteboard or a notebook. I just make a to-do list, every single morning. That just keeps me on track.
Isn't it funny? Like I try to get my partner doesn't have kids, and like he's like the ultimate life hack guy, and I've tried all of his stuff. They all failed. I literally just use my Apple Notes. I'm like, what are the 3 things I want to do today? I'm like, all right, let's go.
Yeah, great book, Checklist Manifesto. I mean, it's a fantastic book that can set you on a path.
Yeah. No, well, you kind of hit on the next one. Give me a book to read. Is that the book to read? Checklist
Manifesto? I mentioned this earlier, but 2 books. All right. Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. All right. And then I'm going to be what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it right now, but Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Cool. That's awesome. And then this is for all the dads listening and myself. Give me a dad hack for managing, running a business, and being a dad.
Do everything your partner wants you to do. All right, when she asks it. How about that? Because that's the only way I can get back upstairs at 8:00 at night to to come work. But I think it's about just being a great partner first and foremost, and then you're obviously a great dad, so that's not hard.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And then the last question I like to ask everybody, like, what is the nicest thing anyone's done for you in your professional career?
In my professional career, yeah. So I think it was when I came out of sports, I didn't have a tech background, and actually my business partner now with Leon VC was an investor in the first company that I had, which was acquired at a later time, and that's a different story. But I didn't have a tech background. I just had an idea, and he took a chance on me, and he invested in us. He was our first friends and family investment, and I think he said he's just like, He's like, you have more tenacity than I've ever seen. And he came from Wall Street. He's like, you have more tenacity and, grit than anything I've ever seen, based off where I worked before. So, I think for me, that was about, instilling belief that, I can live in this space and I'm not just, a coach.
Yeah. That's pretty cool, man. That's a high praise. I feel like tenacity is the ultimate compliment. Is that in the founder potential score? Is there a tenacity score?
In a relative way. We look at grit. We look at all those things. So whatever term you want to use, yes, 100%.
Oh, that's cool. That's an awesome story. Well, cool. Well, Bryan, where should we point people if they want to learn more about you or Leon VC or what you're working on?
Yeah, so leonvc.com for the website. On there, you can find our founder studio. It's 7 days free to join, and every that it's $10 a month. And obviously, we discussed everything. And then, primarily from there, just LinkedIn.
Yeah, and the blog there is pretty strong too. There's some really good content that people should go check out. There's some really good free resources. Well, cool. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for being on. Thanks for playing through the pain, and hope you get feeling better.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Jim.
Cool.